The sun blazed overhead, casting long shadows across the dusty main street of Clearwater Springs as Blaine Mitchell rode in on his black stallion, Midnight. 5 years had passed since he'd last set foot in this town, and the weight of those years and the memories they carried sat heavy on his shoulders like the bounty that had once been on his head. Dust swirled around Midnight's hooves as Blaine pulled to a stop outside the saloon. The town looked much the same: the general store with its faded awning, the blacksmith's forge still belching smoke, and the church steeple rising above the low buildings. But something had changed. Perhaps it was him. The whispers started immediately. A woman hurrying past with a basket of goods stopped in her tracks, her eyes widening before she hurried away. Two men leaning against the hitching post straightened, their hands instinctively moving toward their holsters. "Thought you'd never show your face here again, Mitchell," called one of them, a weathered ranch hand Blaine recognized as Joe Perkins. Blaine didn't respond. He dismounted slowly, deliberately, his spurs jingling against the hard-packed dirt. At 32, he moved with the careful precision of a man who had learned that quick movements often led to quicker deaths. His dark hair fell in waves beneath his hat, and a week's worth of stubble covered his jaw. The scar that ran from his left temple to his cheekbone, a parting gift from his last visit to Clearwater Springs, had faded to a thin white line. "I said," Joe began again, louder. "I heard you, Perkins," Blaine finally replied, his voice low and graveled from too many nights sleeping rough on the trail. "And yet here I am." He tied Midnight to the post and adjusted his gun belt, an automatic gesture born of habit rather than any immediate intention to use the Colt .45 that hung at his side. The leather was worn smooth from years of wear, the holster fitting the gun like a glove. "Sheriff ain't gonna like this," the second man warned, but made no move to stop Blaine as he stepped onto the boardwalk. "Sheriff Preston still around then?" Blaine asked, pausing with one boot on the first step. "He's around, got himself elected proper like 3 years back." Blaine nodded slowly. Good for him. With that, he pushed through the batwing doors of the saloon, stepping from the bright Arizona sunlight into the dim interior. The piano player faltered, missing a note, and then stopped altogether. Conversations died, glasses paused midway to lips. Every eye in the place turned to him. The bartender, a new face Blaine didn't recognize, reached beneath the counter, no doubt for the shotgun all saloon keeps had at the ready. "I'm not looking for trouble," Blaine said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Just a drink and some information." "Your kind always brings trouble," a voice called from the back. Blaine ignored it, walking with measured steps to the bar. "Whiskey," he said to the barkeep, "and leave the bottle." The bartender hesitated, looking past Blaine to someone else in the room. Blaine didn't turn to see who. He knew how this worked. There was always someone who called the shots in a town like this, someone whose nod or shake of the head determined whether a stranger got served or shown the door at the end of a gun. After a moment, the bartender set a glass on the bar and poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into it. He didn't leave the bottle. "Much obliged," Blaine said, dropping coins on the counter. He picked up the glass but didn't drink immediately. Instead, he turned, leaning his back against the bar, and surveyed the room. That's when he saw her. Sitting in the corner with a ledger book open before her was Delia Armstrong. Her chestnut hair was swept up in a practical style, though a few tendrils had escaped to frame her face. She wore a high-collared blue dress, simple but well-made, and the silver locket he'd given her on her 18th birthday still hung around her neck. Their eyes met across the room, and 5 years vanished in an instant. He was 27 again, wild and reckless, promising her the world even as circumstances conspired to tear them apart. She was 23, full of dreams and plans that didn't include loving an outlaw. She was the first to look away, her gaze dropping back to her ledger as if the sight of him meant nothing. But Blaine saw the way her knuckles whitened around her pencil, the slight tremble in her hand as she made a notation in the book. "What brings you back to Clearwater Springs, stranger?" The question came from a tall man seated at a nearby table, playing cards with 3 others. Though he'd called Blaine stranger, The look in his eyes made it clear he knew exactly who had just walked in. "Business," Blaine replied shortly, finally taking a sip of his whiskey. "What kind of business would that be?" the man pressed. "Seeing as how you left here with a price on your head and half the town calling for you to swing." The saloon had gone so quiet that Blaine could hear the creak of the ceiling fan turning lazily overhead. He set his glass down deliberately. "The kind that doesn't concern you, Burns," he said, recognizing the man now as Daniel Burns, the town banker's son who'd always had it out for him. "But if you're curious, I'm here to clear my name." A ripple of murmurs spread through the saloon. "Bit late for that, ain't it?" Burns smirked. "After what you did to the Wilkinson boy," Blaine's jaw tightened. "I didn't kill Tom Wilkinson. That's not how the sheriff tells it. Then the sheriff's been lying to you for 5 years. Blaine looked around the room, meeting the hostile stares head-on. "I'm not the man who rode out of here half a decade ago. I've paid for sins I did commit. I won't keep paying for ones I didn't." His gaze found Delia again. She was watching him now, her expression unreadable. "You've got nerve coming back here, Mitchell," Burns said, pushing back his chair and standing. His hand hovered near his gun. "Clearwater Springs has a long memory." "So do I," Blaine replied evenly. The tension in the room stretched taut as a bowstring. Then, just as Burns' fingers twitched toward his holster, the batwing doors swung open again. "That's enough, Daniel." Sheriff Preston stood in the doorway, thumbs hooked in his belt, the star on his chest catching the light. He was older than Blaine remembered, gray threaded through his mustache and lines carved deeper around his eyes, but his stance was still that of a man accustomed to authority. "Sheriff," Burns acknowledged, his hand moving away from his gun, though reluctantly. Preston's gaze locked on Blaine. "Heard you were back. News travels fast," Blaine observed. "Small town." Preston jerked his head toward the door. "Why don't you come with me, Mitchell? Think you and I need to have a conversation." It wasn't a request. Blaine downed the rest of his whiskey in one swallow, set the glass on the bar, and moved toward the door. As he passed Delia's table, he slowed. "Miss Armstrong," he said softly, tipping his hat. She looked up at him, and for a brief moment, he caught a glimpse of the girl he'd left behind, the one who'd sworn she'd wait for him to clear his name, the one who'd pressed her lips to his in a desperate goodbye as hoofbeats approached in the distance. "Mr. Mitchell," she replied, her voice steadier than her hands. "I trust you've been well." "Well enough," he said. "And you, surviving." She glanced down at her ledger. "I run the saloon now." Surprise flickered across his face. "Your father passed 2 winters ago," she said, cutting him off. "Pneumonia? I'm sorry to hear that." Her eyes met his again, and this time there was a flash of the fire he remembered. "Are you?" Before he could answer, Sheriff Preston cleared his throat pointedly from the doorway. "We'll talk later," Blaine promised her quietly. "I doubt that," Delia replied, turning back to her work. Blaine followed Preston out into the bright sunlight, aware of the eyes following him, the whispers that would erupt the moment he was gone. But it was Delia's dismissal that stung the most, the coolness in her voice where once there had been warmth, the distance in her eyes where once there had been love. He hadn't expected a hero's welcome in Clearwater Springs. But he hadn't expected her to look at him as if he were a stranger, either. The sheriff led him down the street toward the jailhouse, a small adobe building with barred windows and a heavy wooden door. Inside, it was cool and dim, smelling of gun, oil, and old coffee. Preston gestured to a chair in front of his desk. "Sit." Blaine sat, removing his hat and placing it on his knee. Preston remained standing, studying him with narrowed eyes. "You've got some kind of death wish coming back here," the sheriff said finally. "Like I told Burns, I'm here to clear my name." Preston snorted. "Your name's already clear, legally speaking. Governor pardoned you last year along with a bunch of other men who'd served with distinction in that Apache campaign." Blaine blinked in surprise. "You knew about the pardon, got the notice, filed it away." Preston shrugged. "Didn't see much point in announcing it to the town. Far as most folks here are concerned, you killed Tom Wilkinson in cold blood and fled justice. A piece of paper from the governor doesn't change that." "I didn't kill him," Blaine said for the second time that day, "and I think you know that." Preston's eyes narrowed. What I know is that you were found standing over his body with a smoking gun. What I know is that you two had been at each other's throats for weeks over Delia Armstrong. What I know is that instead of standing trial, you ran. I ran because Judge Turner would have hanged me without batting an eye, evidence or no evidence. He never liked that I came from nothing, that I worked for everything I had instead of having it handed to me like his precious godson Tom. So you say. Preston sighed heavily and finally sat down behind his desk. Look, Mitchell, I don't particularly care if you killed Wilkinson or not. That's between you and your maker. But I do care about keeping the peace in my town, and you being here disturbs that peace. I'm not leaving until I find out who really killed Tom, Blaine said, his voice low and determined. I've spent 5 years thinking about that night, going over every detail. Someone else was there, Sheriff, someone who shot Tom and left me to take the blame. And you think after 5 years you're going to find this mysterious someone? Preston sounded skeptical. I have to try. Blaine leaned forward. I lost everything when I rode out of Clearwater Springs, my ranch, my reputation. He hesitated. Delia. Something flickered in Preston's eyes at the mention of her name. She's done fine without you, better even. I can see that, Blaine acknowledged, but it doesn't change the fact that I was wronged, that someone in this town got away with murder and let me pay the price. Preston was quiet for a long moment, tapping his fingers on the desk. Finally, he said, How long do you intend to stay? As long as it takes. The Wilkinson family won't like it. They still have a lot of influence here. I'm not asking for their blessing. Preston sighed again. I can't stop you from staying, not with that pardon in your pocket, but I can't protect you either, not if you start stirring up old troubles. I'm not looking for protection, Blaine said, just the truth. Truth's a funny thing in a town like this, Preston observed. Changes depending on who's telling it. He stood up. You got a place to stay, thought I'd see if my old ranch is still standing. It's not, Preston said bluntly. Wilkinson's bought it at auction after you left, tore down the house, put up something bigger. They run cattle on your land now. The news hit Blaine harder than he'd expected. He'd built that house with his own hands, had planned to raise a family there with Delia. To hear it was gone, there's a room above the livery, Preston continued. Old man Becker rents it out sometimes. It's not much, but it's quiet and he doesn't ask questions. Blaine nodded, rising to his feet and settling his hat back on his head. I appreciate the information. Don't make me regret giving it to you, the sheriff warned. And Mitchell, stay away from the Wilkinsons, all of them. Especially Judge Turner. He may be in his 70s now, but he still pulls a lot of strings in this town. Understood, Blaine said, though they both knew it was a promise he couldn't keep, not if he wanted to find out the truth. As he stepped back out onto the street, Blaine squinted against the bright sunlight. Clearwater Springs sprawled before him, a town that had once been home and was now as hostile as any frontier outpost he'd encountered in his years away. But somewhere in its dusty streets and suspicious glances lay the answer to the question that had haunted him for 5 long years. Who had killed Tom Wilkinson? And why had they let Blaine take the blame? With a grim determination setting his jaw, Blaine headed toward the livery stable. He had a room to secure and a mystery to solve. And perhaps, if the fates were kinder than they'd been 5 years ago, a chance to reclaim at least a piece of what he'd lost. The livery stable stood at the edge of town, a large, weathered building with the scent of hay and horses heavy in the air. As Blaine approached, leading Midnight by the reins, he could hear the rhythmic pounding of a hammer against metal, a sound that took him back to simpler days when his biggest concern had been getting his horse shod or a broken wagon wheel repaired. A wall of heat hit him as he entered the dim interior. At the far end, bent over an anvil, was Walter Becker. The blacksmith was in his 60s now, his arms still corded with muscle from decades of work, though his beard had gone completely white since Blaine had last seen him. Becker looked up at the sound of footsteps, his hammer pausing mid-swing. Recognition followed quickly by wariness crossed his weathered face. Mitchell, he said, straightening up. Heard you were back. Word travels fast, Blaine observed for the second time that day, always does. Becker set his hammer down and wiped his hands on his leather apron. What can I do for you? Sheriff Preston mentioned you might have a room to rent. Becker's bushy eyebrows rose. Did he now? Interesting. He studied Blaine for a long moment, then nodded toward Midnight. That's a fine horse. Morgan Quarter Horse Cross, raised him from a colt. Been a good companion, I'd wager. The best, Blaine agreed, patting Midnight's neck. Loyal, doesn't ask questions or pass judgment. A ghost of a smile crossed Becker's face. Rare qualities indeed. He hesitated, then gestured toward a ladder leading to a loft. Rooms up there, $10 a week paid in advance, includes stable space for your horse and feed. That's fair, Blaine said, reaching into his pocket for the money. I appreciate it. Becker accepted the coins with a nod. There's rules. No drinking up there, do that at the saloon. No women, won't be an issue, Blaine interrupted. And no trouble, Becker finished, his gaze sharp. I don't care what business you've got in Clearwater Springs, but don't bring it back here. Understood. The blacksmith seemed satisfied with that. There's a pump out back for washing. Privy to. I take breakfast at 6 if you want to join, but I don't expect conversation. Sounds perfect, Blaine said sincerely. Becker nodded toward an empty stall. Put your horse there, tack rooms to the right. As Blaine began unsaddling Midnight, the blacksmith returned to his work, the rhythmic clanging of his hammer filling the stable once more. Blaine worked methodically, removing the saddle and bridle, giving Midnight a good rub-down with a handful of straw. The horse nudged him affectionately, sensing perhaps that they had finally stopped running. We're staying put for a while, boy, Blaine murmured, patting the animal's sleek neck. Got some ghosts that need laying to rest. Once Midnight was settled with fresh water and hay, Blaine climbed the ladder to the loft room. It was simple but clean: a narrow bed, a washstand with a cracked mirror, a small table with a single chair, and a trunk for his belongings. A window overlooked the back of the property, offering a view of the open prairie beyond the town limits. Blaine set his saddlebags on the bed and unpacked the few possessions he'd carried with him during his years on the move: a spare shirt, a razor, a dog-eared book of poetry he'd never admit to reading, and a small photograph in a tarnished silver frame. He hesitated before removing the last item, turning it over in his hands. The photograph showed a younger Delia, her hair loose around her shoulders, her smile bright and carefree. It had been taken on her 21st birthday, 2 years before everything fell apart. He'd carried it with him through deserts and mountains, through gunfights and lonely nights, a reminder of what he'd lost and what he hoped to regain. He placed it on the table, propped against the wall, then sat heavily on the bed. 5 years of hard living had taught him patience, but now that he was back in Clearwater Springs, with Delia so close yet so distant, that patience threatened to desert him. One step at a time, he reminded himself. First, secure a place to stay done. Next, start asking questions carefully about the night Tom Wilkinson died. And somehow, find a way to speak with Delia alone, away from the judging eyes of the town. The sound of hoofbeats outside drew his attention to the window. A woman on horseback rode past, her back straight, her riding habit a deep forest green that caught the late afternoon sunlight. Even from behind, Blaine recognized the proud tilt of her head, the graceful way she handled her mount. Delia had always loved riding. They'd spent countless hours exploring the countryside together, racing across open meadows, picnicking beside the creek that cut through what had once been his property. She rode differently now, he noticed, more formally, more constrained, as if she'd embraced the very societal strictures she'd once railed against. Blaine watched until she disappeared from view, heading toward the edge of town where her father's her house must be. Then he turned away from the window, picked up his hat, and headed back down the ladder. He had questions that needed answers, and the first place to start was with people who might still be willing to talk to him. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon as Blaine made his way back into town. The main street was quieter now as people headed home for their evening meals. He avoided the saloon. He wasn't ready to face Delia again just yet, and instead headed for a small cabin set back from the road near the church. Doc Wilson had been Clearwater Springs' physician for as long as anyone could remember. He delivered most of the town's children, tended to their injuries, and eased their passage from this world when the time came. He was also one of the few people who had openly stated his belief in Blaine's innocence 5 years ago. The cabin looked much the same, a bit more weathered perhaps, the garden a little more overgrown. Blaine knocked on the door, not sure what kind of reception to expect. Doc had been old 5 years ago. He might not even be. The door swung open to reveal a tall, thin man with a shock of white hair and spectacles perched on the end of his nose. His eyes widened in surprise, then crinkled with genuine pleasure. "Blaine Mitchell," he said warmly. "Well, I'll be damned." "Hello, Doc," Blaine said, relief washing over him at the friendly greeting. "Hope I'm not intruding." "Nonsense. Come in, come in." Doc Wilson stepped back, ushering Blaine into the cabin. The interior was cluttered but cozy, with medical books lining the walls and the smell of herbs hanging in the air. "Sit down. I was just about to have some coffee." "You'll join me?" "Gladly," Blaine said, taking a seat at the small table while Doc busied himself with 2 mugs. "Heard you were back in town," Doc said conversationally. "Caused quite a stir at Martha's tea circle this afternoon, I can tell you." Blaine smiled faintly. "I imagine it did." "People have long memories in a place like this," Doc continued, bringing the coffee to the table and sitting down across from Blaine. "But I always said you'd be back someday. Told Martha just last month that boy will return to clear his name if it's the last thing he does." "You knew I didn't kill Tom," Blaine said, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "Course I knew." Doc took a sip of his coffee. "I examined the body, remember? Tom Wilkinson was shot from at least 10 feet away. You were standing right over him when they found you, gun in hand." "The angle was all wrong." Blaine leaned forward, his heart rate picking up. "Did you tell the sheriff that?" "I told everyone who would listen," Doc said with a touch of bitterness. But Judge Turner had already made up his mind, and no one was going to contradict him, not when it was his godson lying dead and an upstart like you the convenient suspect. "But if the physical evidence can be interpreted different ways," Doc interrupted gently. "And when the most powerful man in the county has decided on a particular interpretation, well," he shrugged. "That's why you ran, isn't it? You knew you wouldn't get a fair trial." Blaine nodded slowly. "I thought if I laid low for a while, let tempers cool, maybe the real killer would be found." "I never imagined it would be 5 years. And now you're back to finish what was started," Doc observed, "to find out who really killed Tom Wilkinson." "Yes," Blaine met the older man's gaze directly. "Do you have any ideas?" Doc sighed, setting down his mug. "I've thought about that night a lot over the years. Tom was well liked by most, but he had his share of enemies. He wasn't always kind in his business dealings, and he could be persistent when it came to women." "Delia," Blaine said, his jaw tightening. "Among others," Doc acknowledged. "But it was his rivalry with you that everyone focused on. You were both interested in the same woman, both ambitious young men building your futures, when he turned up dead after you two had that very public argument in the saloon." "It was the perfect setup," Blaine finished grimly. "I was the obvious suspect. Too obvious, in my opinion." Doc studied him thoughtfully. "What do you remember about that night?" Blaine closed his eyes, letting his mind travel back to that fateful evening. "I was at home at my ranch. It was late, maybe 10 o'clock. I heard a rider approaching, went out with my gun just to be safe. It was Tom. He was drunk, agitated, said he needed to talk to me about Delia. And we argued. He said some things about her, about us." Blaine's hands clenched around his mug. "I hit him, once. He fell, and when he got up, he had his gun out. I drew mine, but before either of us could fire, there was a shot from somewhere nearby. Tom went down. I dropped to check on him, and that's when Sheriff Preston and his deputies arrived." "Convenient timing," Doc murmured. "Too convenient," Blaine agreed. "Someone must have told them to come out to my place, someone who knew what was about to happen, or someone who planned it," Doc suggested. "Have you considered that Tom might not have been the intended victim? That perhaps you were meant to die that night and things didn't go according to plan?" The thought sent a chill down Blaine's spine. "But why? I wasn't wealthy or powerful. I was just a rancher trying to make my way." A rancher whose land happened to sit on the proposed route for the new railroad, Doc pointed out. A rancher who refused to sell when the Wilkinsons approached you with an offer. Blaine stared at him. The railroad, it came through, construction starts next spring. The depot will be built right where your house used to stand. Doc's expression was grim. Judge Turner and the Wilkinsons made a fortune selling that land to the railroad company. The pieces were starting to fall into place. So someone wanted my land and I wouldn't sell. Then Tom ends up dead on my property. I'm forced to flee and the Wilkinsons conveniently acquire my ranch at auction. It's a theory, Doc cautioned, but one worth exploring. Who else knew about the railroad plans back then? Blaine asked. They weren't public knowledge. The usual suspects. Judge Turner, Bank President Wilkinson, Tom's father, Mayor Hollister. Doc hesitated. And Daniel Burns, his father, was the one negotiating with the railroad company. The same Daniel Burns who had confronted Blaine in the saloon earlier. Interesting. What about Sheriff Preston? Blaine asked. Was he involved? Doc stroked his chin thoughtfully. Preston's always been a bit of an enigma. He does his job, keeps the peace, but he's never quite fit in with Turner's circle. They tolerate him because he's good at what he does, but I've never seen him socializing with them. Yet he was quick to believe I killed Tom. He went where the evidence pointed, Doc said fairly, and you didn't help your case by running. Blaine couldn't argue with that. He took another sip of his coffee, now cooling. And Delia, how has she been, really? A shadow crossed Doc's face. She took it hard when you left, defended you at first, insisted you were innocent, but as time passed and you didn't return or even send word. Guilt twisted in Blaine's gut. I couldn't risk contacting her. If they'd intercepted any messages, I understand that, Doc assured him. But Delia didn't know what to think. After her father died, she threw herself into running the saloon. She's done well with it, turned it from a rough, watering hole into a respectable establishment, but she's different, harder, more guarded. She's not married. Blaine asked, the question that had been burning in his mind since he first saw her again. No, though not for lack of suitors. Doc gave him a knowing look. Daniel Burns has been particularly persistent these past couple of years. The thought of Burns courting Delia made Blaine's blood boil, but he kept his expression neutral. I need to talk to her, Doc. Explain what happened, why I stayed away. Tread carefully there, Doc warned. Delia's built walls around her heart, and they won't come down easily. He paused, then added more gently, she loved you very much, Blaine, the kind of love that, when broken, leaves scars. I never stopped loving her, Blaine said quietly, not for a single day. Then tell her that, Doc advised, but be prepared for her not to believe you. Trust is like a mirror once broken. You never see the reflection the same way again. They talked a while longer, Doc filling Blaine in on the changes in town over the past 5 years, who had died, who had married, who had moved away. It was nearly dark when Blaine finally took his leave, promising to return soon. Be careful, Doc cautioned as Blaine stepped out onto the porch. Whoever killed Tom Wilkinson is still out there, and if they realize you're back to uncover the truth. I'll watch my back, Blaine assured him. Thank you, Doc, for the coffee and for believing in me. Truth has a way of surfacing eventually, Doc said with a small smile. Like a body in water, you can weigh it down, but given enough time, it'll rise to the top. With that cheerful metaphor ringing in his ears, Blaine headed back toward town. The streets were quiet now, lanterns glowing in windows as families settled in for the evening. The saloon would be busy, though it always was after sundown, and Delia would be there. Before he could talk himself out of it, Blaine changed direction, heading for the saloon. The piano music drifted out into the night, along with the sounds of laughter and conversation. He paused outside, straightening his hat and brushing dust from his coat. Then, taking a deep breath, he pushed through the batwing doors. The saloon was indeed busy, but not rowdy. True to Doc's word, Delia had transformed the place. The spittoons were gone, replaced by potted plants. The mirrors behind the bar gleamed, no longer clouded with years of tobacco smoke. Even the clientele seemed different, still cowboys and townspeople, but better behaved, many eating proper meals at the tables instead of just drinking. Delia stood behind the bar, serving drinks with efficient grace. She changed from her riding clothes into a dress of deep burgundy, her hair still pinned up but with more care than earlier. She looked up as Blaine entered, and for a brief moment, something flickered in her eyes, something that might have been longing, quickly masked by cool professionalism. "Mr. Mitchell," she acknowledged as he approached the bar. "What can I get you?" "A whiskey," he said, "and a few minutes of your time if you can spare it." Her eyes flicked to the crowded room. "As you can see, we're quite busy tonight." "After closing, then," he persisted. "Please, Delia." 5 minutes. She studied him for a long moment, then turned to fetch a glass and the bottle of whiskey. "I close at midnight," she said as she poured his drink. "Not a minute before." "I'll wait," he promised. She slid the glass toward him, careful that their fingers didn't touch. 5 minutes. "No more, thank you." He raised the glass slightly in a toast, then moved away from the bar to find a quiet corner. As luck would have it, the only empty table was near where Daniel Burns sat with a group of well-dressed businessmen from the look of them, possibly discussing the coming railroad. Burns looked up as Blaine approached, his eyes narrowing. "Mitchell," he said loudly enough to draw attention. "Decided to stick around, I see." "For now," Blaine replied neutrally, taking a seat at the neighboring table. Burns turned in his chair to face him more directly. "You know, I've been wondering all day why a man would return to a town where he's about as welcome as a rattlesnake at a picnic." "Maybe he has unfinished business," Blaine suggested, taking a sip of his whiskey. "Or maybe he doesn't know when to stay gone." Burns leaned forward. "Word of advice, Mitchell. Whatever business you think you have here, conclude it quickly. Clearwater Springs has moved on. Best you do the same." "I appreciate your concern," Blaine said mildly, "but I've never been one to leave things half-finished." Burns' jaw tightened. "Some things are better left buried." "Like the truth about Tom Wilkinson's murder?" Blaine asked quietly, a flicker of something anger crossed Burns' face. "That truth is already known. You shot him. We both know that's not what happened." Burns stared at him for a long moment, then abruptly stood. "Gentlemen," he said to his companions, "I believe I've lost my appetite for both drink and conversation. Shall we continue our discussion tomorrow?" The other men murmured their agreement, casting curious glances between Burns and Blaine as they gathered their hats and departed. Burns was the last to leave, pausing by Blaine's table. "Stay away from Delia," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "She's suffered enough because of you." Before Blaine could respond, Burns strode out, leaving an uncomfortable silence in his wake. From behind the bar, Delia watched the exchange, her expression unreadable. The next few hours passed slowly. Blaine nursed his whiskey, ordered a simple meal when one of the barmaids approached him, and observed the comings and goings in the saloon. He noted who spoke to whom, who avoided whom, the small social dynamics that made up the fabric of a town like Clearwater Springs. Shortly before midnight, the crowd began to thin. By a quarter past, only a handful of patrons remained, and Delia was giving them pointed looks. By 1:30, the saloon was empty save for Blaine, Delia, and the young man sweeping the floor. "You can finish that tomorrow, Robbie," Delia told the sweeper. "It's late." The young man nodded, propping his broom against the wall. "Night, Miss Armstrong." As soon as they were alone, Delia began extinguishing the lamps, leaving only those near the bar lit. Blaine rose and approached her, keeping the bar between them as a concession to her obvious wariness. "You've done well with this place," he observed. "Your father would be proud." "My father wanted me to sell it after he died," she replied, her hands busy with tidying glasses. "Said it was no life for a woman alone, but I'm stubborn, as you might recall." "I recall," Blaine said with a small smile. "It was one of the things I loved about you." Her hands stilled. "Don't," she said softly. "Don't what?" "Don't talk as if nothing's changed. As if you didn't disappear for 5 years without a word." She looked up at him then, and the hurt in her eyes was like a physical blow. "Do you have any idea what that was like? Waiting, hoping, imagining every terrible fate that might have befallen you." "I couldn't contact you," Blaine said, leaning forward earnestly. "It was too dangerous for both of us. If Judge Turner had known we were in communication, so you let me think you were dead," she exclaimed. "Or worse, that you'd forgotten all about me, about us, about the plans we made." I never forgot, he said quietly. Not for a single day. She turned away, blinking rapidly. Your 5 minutes are up, Mr. Mitchell. Delia, please. He moved around the bar, coming to stand behind her, close enough to catch the familiar scent of lavender in her hair. I came back for you. To clear my name, yes, but also for you, for us. If there's still a chance, there is no us, she said firmly, turning to face him. They were inches apart now, and Blaine could see the pulse fluttering at the base of her throat, just above the silver locket. He'd given her the locket she still wore despite everything. Too much time has passed, too much has happened. Like what? He challenged gently. Tell me you don't feel anything when you look at me. Tell me you've forgotten what we were to each other. Of course I haven't forgotten, she admitted, her voice breaking slightly, but feeling something and acting on it are two very different things. I built a life here, Blaine, a good life. I can't just throw that away because you've decided to come back. I'm not asking you to throw anything away, he said. I'm asking for a chance to explain, to make things right. She shook her head, taking a step back. It's too late for that. Is it because of Burns? Blaine asked, unable to keep the edge from his voice. Doc mentioned he's been courting you. My relationship with Daniel is none of your concern, she said, her chin lifting in that defiant way he remembered so well. It is as if he was involved in framing me for murder, Blaine retorted. Delia's eyes widened. What are you talking about? Briefly, Blaine explained what Doc had told him about the railroad, about how his land had been the key to the deal that made the Wilkinsons and Burns a fortune. That's absurd, Delia said when he finished. Daniel may be many things, but he's not a murderer. Someone killed Tom Wilkinson and let me take the blame, Blaine insisted. Someone who stood to gain from my disappearance. And you think that someone was Daniel? She shook her head in disbelief. Tom was his friend. Friends fall out. Especially when there's money involved. Blaine stepped closer again. Delia, I need your help. You know everyone in this town, you hear things others don't. If you could just keep your eyes and ears open. No, she said firmly. I won't spy for you, Blaine. I won't be part of some vendetta against people who have been nothing but kind to me since my father died. Kind, Blaine repeated incredulously. The Wilkinsons, Judge Turner, these are the people who would have seen me hang for a crime I didn't commit. And how do I know you didn't commit it? She shot back. Because you say so. Because Doc Wilson has a theory. That's not proof, Blaine. That's just hope. And hope isn't enough to accuse respected members of this community of murder and conspiracy. Her words stung, but there was truth in them. He didn't have proof, not yet. I understand, he said finally. I won't ask you to take sides, but I am going to find out what really happened that night with or without your help. And then what? She asked, suddenly sounding tired. Say you prove your innocence. What happens next? You expect to just pick up where we left off, build that life we planned, if you'll have me, he said simply. Something flickered in her eyes, longing, perhaps, or just remembered pain. Good night, Mr. Mitchell, she said, turning away to continue extinguishing the lamps. Please see yourself out. Blaine stood for a moment longer, wanting to say more to make her understand, but he recognized the set of her shoulders, the firm line of her mouth. She was done talking, at least for tonight. Good night, Delia, he said softly. Thank you for the 5 minutes. He left the saloon, stepping out into the cool night air. The street was deserted, the town quiet except for the distant howl of a coyote somewhere out on the prairie. Blaine stood for a moment, looking up at the stars scattered across the Inkai sky. The same stars that had guided him across countless miles, that had watched over him on lonely nights when memories of Delia were all that kept him going. He hadn't expected her to fall into his arms. But he hadn't expected such resistance either, such unwillingness to even consider that he might be telling the truth. Something had hardened in her during his absence, or perhaps it had always been there, a core of steel beneath the warmth and laughter he remembered. Either way, it was clear that winning back Delia's trust would be just as challenging as clearing his name, and he couldn't do one without the other. With a sigh, Blaine headed back toward the livery stable. Tomorrow was another day. Another chance to uncover the truth that had been buried for 5 long years. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect spring day that once would have found Blaine checking his fences or breaking a new horse. Instead, he sat at Becker's small kitchen table, quietly eating the simple breakfast the blacksmith had prepared: biscuits, bacon, and strong coffee. True to his word, Becker didn't seem inclined toward conversation, which suited Blaine fine. His mind was busy mapping out his next steps. He needed to learn more about the railroad deal, about who had known what and when, and he needed to find out who else might have had a reason to want Tom Wilkinson dead. "Heading into town?" Becker asked as Blaine finished his coffee. "Yes," Blaine replied. "Thought I'd stop by the land office, check some records," Becker nodded. "Cleary opens at 9, closes for lunch at noon sharp." "Thanks for the information." Blaine stood, reaching for his hat. "And for breakfast." "Part of the arrangement," Becker said with a shrug. Then, as Blaine turned to leave, he added, "Mitchell, people are watching you, be careful." Blaine paused at the door. "Expecting trouble, always," the blacksmith said grimly, "especially when it comes to old wounds being reopened." With that cryptic warning, Blaine headed into town. The main street was busy with morning activity: shopkeepers sweeping their storefronts, wagons delivering goods, children hurrying to the schoolhouse at the far end of the street. He received his share of stares and whispers, but no one approached him or tried to bar his way. The land office was a small building next to the bank, its windows spotless and its brass plaque gleaming in the morning sun. Inside, a bell above the door announced his arrival. A thin man with spectacles looked up from a ledger, his expression changing from professional welcome to wary recognition. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, standing. "What brings you to the land office, Mr. Cleary?" Blaine acknowledged. "I'd like to see the records for my old property. And for any railroad transactions in the county over the past 5 years. Cleary hesitated. "Those would be public records, of course, but I'm not sure I can." "Can what?" Blaine interrupted mildly. "Show me documents that any citizen has a right to examine. It's just that." "Well, Judge Turner was quite specific about keeping information from me," Blaine finished, his voice hardening. "I don't recall Judge Turner being appointed keeper of public records. Now, are you going to show me those documents, or do I need to speak with Sheriff Preston about obstruction?" The threat was a bluff. Preston was unlikely to intervene on Blaine's behalf, but Cleary didn't know that. The clerk swallowed nervously, then nodded. "Of course. Please have a seat. I'll bring the relevant files." While Cleary disappeared into a back room, Blaine took a seat at the small table designated for reviewing documents. A few minutes later, the clerk returned with several leather-bound volumes and a stack of individual papers. "These are the property transactions for your former ranch," he explained, setting down the first volume. "And these," he indicated the stack of papers, "are the railroad negotiations and final contracts. Will there be anything else?" "This will do for now," Blaine said. "Thank you." Cleary hovered uncertainly. "I'll be at my desk if you need assistance." Once the clerk retreated, Blaine began his examination. The property records were straightforward enough after he fled. His ranch had been seized by the county, then sold at auction to Wilkinson Sr. for a fraction of its value. No surprises there. The railroad documents were more interesting. The negotiations had begun 6 months before Tom's murder, with initial surveys of possible routes through the county. Blaine's land had been identified early on as a key parcel due to its water access and relatively flat terrain. The first offer to purchase had been made 4 months before the murder, an offer Blaine had rejected outright, as he had no intention of selling the home he'd built for himself and Delia. What caught his attention, though, was a notation dated just 1 week before Tom's death. It was a letter from the railroad company, indicating that they were considering an alternate route that would bypass Clearwater Springs entirely if the Mitchell parcel couldn't be secured. Such a route would be more expensive to build, but might prove more economical in the long run. That changed everything. If the railroad had bypassed Clearwater Springs, the town might well have withered and died, as so many frontier settlements did when progress passed them by. The Wilkinsons' investments would have been worthless. Burns' father's bank would have suffered. Judge Turner's influence would have diminished. All of them had a powerful motive to ensure that Blaine's land became available one way or another. Blaine was so engrossed in his discovery that he didn't immediately notice the man who entered the land office. It was only when a shadow fell across the documents that he looked up to find Judge Turner standing before him. The judge had aged considerably in 5 years. His once imposing frame had shrunk, his shoulders stooped beneath his black coat. But his eyes were as cold and sharp as ever, glittering with undisguised hatred as they met Blaine's. "Mitchell," he said, his voice still carrying the authority that had once sentenced men to hang. "I was told you were back. I didn't quite believe it." Blaine rose slowly to his feet, not out of respect, but to avoid being at a disadvantage. "Judge Turner, examining public records, I see." Turner's gaze flicked to the documents spread before Blaine. "Reliving past glories. Or perhaps seeking to understand just how thoroughly you've been forgotten." "Neither," Blaine replied evenly. "Just filling in some gaps in my knowledge, learning who benefited from Tom's death, for instance." Turner's face flushed with anger. "How dare you speak his name? You murdered my godson in cold blood, and yet you stand here." "I didn't kill Tom," Blaine interrupted, keeping his voice steady. "And I think you know that." "What I know," Turner said, leaning forward, "is that you were found standing over his body with a gun in your hand. What I know is that you fled rather than face justice. Those are the actions of a guilty man. Or of a man who knew he wouldn't receive a fair trial," Blaine countered. "Not with you presiding." Turner's lips curled into a sneer. "You always did think yourself clever, above the law. Better than those who built this town." He straightened, adjusting his coat. "Let me be perfectly clear, Mitchell. Your presence in Clearwater Springs is not welcome. Governor's pardon or no, the people here know what you did, they remember, and they won't rest easy until you're gone." "Is that a threat, Judge?" "A statement of fact," Turner replied coldly. "You took something precious from this community, from me. Don't expect forgiveness." "I don't want forgiveness," Blaine said. "I want the truth." "The truth," Turner repeated with a harsh laugh. "The truth is that you're a killer who somehow slipped the noose. The truth is that you destroyed not only Tom's life but Delia Armstrong's as well. She was never the same after you ran." Blaine's jaw tightened. "I think Delia can speak for herself about how my actions affected her." "Indeed she can," Turner agreed, "and I'm quite certain she's made her feelings clear. After all, she's practically family now." "What does that mean?" Blaine demanded. Turner smiled, a cold, satisfied expression. "Didn't she tell you? Delia and Daniel Burns are to be married next month. The announcement was made just last week at the Founders' Day celebration." The news hit Blaine like a physical blow. Delia married to Burns? It couldn't be true. She would have mentioned it last night during their conversation, unless she hadn't wanted to hurt him further. Or unless she'd planned to tell him but lost her nerve when he spoke of still loving her. "I see from your expression that this comes as a surprise," Turner observed with evident satisfaction. "Did you imagine she would wait for you forever, that her life would simply stop while you were gone?" "She moved on, Mitchell, as did we all." Before Blaine could respond, the door to the land office opened again and Sheriff Preston stepped in. He took in the scene with a quick glance, his expression hardening. "Judge Turner," he acknowledged. "Mitchell, everything all right in here?" "Perfectly fine, Sheriff," Turner replied smoothly. "Mr. Mitchell and I were just discussing old times." "Is that right?" Preston looked skeptical. "Sounded more like an argument from outside." "A difference of opinion, perhaps," Turner conceded, "but nothing requiring your intervention." He turned back to Blaine. "Remember what I said, Mitchell. Some doors are better left closed." With that, the judge departed, leaving a tense silence in his wake. Preston watched him go, then turned to Blaine. "You all right?" he asked gruffly. Blaine nodded, though he felt far from all right. "He mentioned something about Delia and Burns getting married. Is that true?" Preston sighed. "It's true they're engaged. Burns proposed at the Founders' Day dance, made quite a show of it. But if you're asking if Delia looked like a woman in love," he shrugged, "that's not for me to say." "Why didn't you mention it yesterday?" Blaine asked. "Didn't see how it was relevant to your situation," Preston replied, "and it wasn't my news to share." He nodded toward the documents on the table. "Finding what you're looking for." Maybe, Blaine said, gathering the papers and returning them to Cleary, who had been watching the exchange with undisguised interest. Thank you for your help, he told the clerk. Outside, Preston fell into step beside him. Judge Turner's not a man you want as an enemy, he warned. Too late for that, Blaine said grimly. What did you find in there that got him so riled up? Blaine glanced at the sheriff, considering how much to reveal. Preston hadn't been openly hostile to him, but neither had he been particularly helpful. Still, he might be an ally if shown the right evidence. The railroad deal, Blaine said finally. A week before Tom was killed, the company was considering an alternate route that would have bypassed Clearwater Springs entirely if they couldn't get my land. Preston whistled low. That would have been a death sentence for the town. Exactly. Then suddenly Tom is dead, I'm on the run, and my land is sold to the Wilkinsons for a fraction of its worth. Convenient, wouldn't you say? Convenient, yes, Preston allowed, but it doesn't prove murder or conspiracy. It's motive, Blaine insisted. Strong motive for several powerful men to want me out of the way. Maybe, Preston said doubtfully, but motive isn't enough to accuse a man like Judge Turner or Wilkinson SR of murder. You'd need evidence, witnesses. I'm working on that, Blaine said. In the meantime, I'd appreciate it if you kept what I've told you to yourself. Preston looked offended. I don't gossip, Mitchell, but I do my job. If you find actual evidence of a crime, bring it to me. Otherwise, don't go stirring up trouble with accusations you can't back up. With that warning, the sheriff tipped his hat and continued on his way, leaving Blaine standing in the middle of the street, his mind racing with this new information about Delia and Burns. Engaged, to be married in a month. The thought made his stomach churn. But why hadn't she mentioned it last night? Why was she still wearing his locket if she was promised to another man? And why had Burns been so threatened by Blaine's return if he was secure in Delia's affections? None of it made sense. And Blaine was beginning to think that Delia's engagement was tied to the larger mystery of Tom's murder in ways he didn't yet understand. He needed to talk to her again. But first, he had another visit to make. The Wilkinson estate lay a mile outside of town, a sprawling ranch house surrounded by well-tended gardens and outbuildings. It had been impressive 5 years ago. Now it was ostentatious, with new wings added and a wrought iron fence surrounding the property. Blaine approached on foot, having left midnight at the livery to avoid drawing attention. A ranch hand spotted him as he neared the gate and moved to intercept him. This is private property, the man said, his hand resting meaningfully on the gun at his hip. I'm here to see Mr. Wilkinson, Blaine said. He ain't receiving visitors today. Tell him Blaine Mitchell is here, Blaine persisted. I think he'll make an exception. The ranch hand's eyes widened slightly at the name, but he nodded curtly. Wait here. Several minutes passed before the man returned, looking unhappy. Mr. Wilkinson will see you. Follow me and keep your hands where I can see them. Blaine was led not to the main house, but to a smaller building nearby a study or office, judging by the books lining the walls and the large desk dominating the room. Behind that desk sat Harold Wilkinson, Tom's father, a heavyset man with thinning gray hair and cold eyes. Mitchell, he said as Blaine entered, you have some nerve coming here. Hello, Mr. Wilkinson, Blaine replied, removing his hat. Thank you for seeing me. I'm seeing you only to tell you in person to stay away from my family, Wilkinson said coldly. We've suffered enough because of you. I understand your grief, Blaine said carefully. Losing a son is a terrible thing, but I didn't kill Tom. Wilkinson's face flushed with anger. We found you standing over his body. You found me trying to help him, Blaine corrected, after someone else shot him. A convenient story with no witnesses to back it up. Wilkinson leaned forward. Why are you really here, Mitchell, to torment us with your presence, to dredge up painful memories? I'm here for the truth, Blaine said simply. About that night, about the railroad deal that depended on my land. About why someone would want to frame me for murder. Something flickered in Wilkinson's eyes, fear, perhaps. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do, Blaine said. I think you knew about the alternate route the railroad was considering. I think you knew that if they bypassed Clearwater Springs, your investments would be worthless. That's absurd, Wilkinson blustered. The railroad was always going to come through here. Your land was just convenient enough to kill for, Blaine asked quietly. Wilkinson's face drained of color. Are you accusing me of murdering my own son? No, Blaine said. I'm suggesting that whoever killed Tom intended to frame me all along, that Tom's death was a means to an end getting me out of the way so my land could be acquired for the railroad. Get out, Wilkinson said, his voice shaking with rage or fear. Blaine couldn't tell which. Get out before I have you thrown out. Blaine held his ground. One more question, Mr. Wilkinson. Who knew about the railroad's alternate route proposal? Besides you and Judge Turner, I said get out. Wilkinson was on his feet now, reaching for a bell on his desk that would summon his men. Was it Burns? Blaine pressed. Did he know what was at stake if my land couldn't be secured? Wilkinson's hand froze above the bell, his eyes widening slightly. It was all the confirmation Blaine needed. Thank you for your time, he said, settling his hat back on his head. I'll see myself out. As he walked back toward town, Blaine's mind raced. Wilkinson's reaction when he mentioned Burns was telling. The banker's son had known about the alternate route, had perhaps been the one to discover it in the first place, given his father's role in the negotiations. And now Burns was engaged to Delia. The pieces were starting to fit together, forming a picture that Blaine didn't like at all. But he needed more than suspicions and reactions. He needed proof if he was going to convince Delia and the rest of Clearwater Springs of the truth. The sun was high overhead when Blaine reached town again. His stomach reminded him that he hadn't eaten since breakfast, so he headed for the small cafe near the general store. As he approached, he saw a familiar figure seated alone at one of the outdoor tables. Delia, picking at a plate of food and looking lost in thought. Before he could decide whether to approach her or leave her be, she looked up and saw him. Their eyes met across the street, and for a moment neither moved. Then, to his surprise, she gestured slightly to the empty chair across from her, an invitation, or at least not a rejection. Blaine crossed the street and approached her table, aware of the curious glances from other diners. Miss Armstrong, he said formally, for the benefit of listening ears. May I join you, please, she replied, equally formal. I was just finishing my lunch. He sat, removing his hat and placing it on the table. A waitress approached, eyeing him warily, but took his order for coffee and a sandwich without comment. Once she was gone, Blaine spoke quietly. I didn't expect to see you here. I often take lunch at Clara's, Delia replied. The saloon doesn't serve food until evening. I meant I didn't expect you to invite me to join you, Blaine clarified. Not after last night. She looked down at her plate. I've been thinking about what you said, about finding the truth. She hesitated, then met his gaze directly. I want to know what really happened that night too, Blaine. I've lived with uncertainty for 5 years and I'm tired of it. Hope surged in his chest. Does that mean you believe I might be innocent? It means I'm willing to listen, she said carefully. To consider possibilities I've spent years trying to ignore. It was more than he'd expected. Thank you. She nodded slightly, then asked, What have you learned so far? Briefly, Blaine told her about his discoveries at the land office, his conversation with Doc, and his visit to Wilkinson. He left out his suspicions about Burns for now, not wanting to push too far too fast. Delia listened intently, her brow furrowing as he explained about the railroad's alternate route. I never knew that, she said when he finished. Father was on the town council then, but he never mentioned it. It was probably kept quiet, Blaine said, to avoid panic if people had known the railroad might bypass Clearwater Springs. There would have been an uproar, she agreed. Property values would have plummeted overnight. Exactly. Blaine leaned forward. The only people who knew were those with the most to lose: Judge Turner, the Wilkinsons, the Burns family. Delia's eyes narrowed slightly. You're suggesting one of them killed Tom to frame you? I'm suggesting it's a possibility worth exploring, Blaine said carefully. Someone shot Tom that night, Delia. It wasn't me. And whoever did it made sure I'd take the blame. She was quiet for a long moment, absently twisting the silver locket around her neck, a gesture Blaine remembered from years ago, something she did when deep in thought. Judge Turner told me you know about my engagement, she said finally, changing the subject. He did, Blaine acknowledged, though I would have preferred to hear it from you. She met his gaze directly. Would you have preferred I told you last night? When you spoke of still loving me, of wanting another chance, I would have preferred honesty, he said quietly, however painful. Honesty, she repeated with a soft, humorless laugh. All right then, honestly. I accepted Daniel's proposal because he's been kind to me, because he offers stability and respectability, and because after 5 years of waiting for a man who never returned, never even sent word that he was alive, I decided it was time to move on with my life. The words stung, but Blaine nodded. That's fair. Is it? She asked, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. Is it fair that the moment you walk back into town, everything I've built, every wall I've put up, every decision I've made to protect myself from more pain, all of it suddenly feels like a lie? Blaine's heart raced at her admission. Delia, no, she cut him off, straightening in her chair. I shouldn't have said that. It was unfair to Daniel. Do you love him? Blaine asked, unable to stop himself. She looked away. He's a good man. That's not what I asked. It's all you're entitled to know, she replied, a flash of the old fire in her eyes. Then, more gently, I made a commitment, Blaine. I intend to honor it. Before he could respond, the waitress returned with his order. The interruption broke the tension between them, allowing Delia to compose herself and Blaine to gather his thoughts. I understand, he said when they were alone again, and I respect your decision, but I still need your help to find the truth about that night. Not for us, he hurried on when she looked like she might object, but for justice, for closure, for both of us. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. What do you need from me? Information, he said. You hear things at the saloon that others don't. People talk freely when they're drinking, especially if a pretty woman is listening. A faint smile touched her lips. I've noticed. Have you ever heard anything about that night? Any rumors, any slips of the tongue that might suggest someone else was involved? She considered the question carefully. Not specifically about that night, no, but she hesitated. There was something strange that happened about a month after you left. Daniel and his father had an argument, a bad one. They thought they were alone in the bank, but I'd gone in after hours to make a deposit from the saloon. I heard Daniel shouting something about blood on our hands and his father telling him to be quiet, that it was taken care of. Blaine's pulse quickened. Did you ask Daniel about it later? I tried, she said. He brushed it off, said it was about a bad loan his father had approved against his advice. The borrower had lost everything, killed himself. Daniel blamed his father for pushing the man too hard. Did you believe him? At the time, yes, she admitted. But now, with what you've told me. She shook her head. I don't know. It wasn't much, but it was something, a crack in Burns' facade, a hint that he might know more than he'd admitted about the events surrounding Tom's death. There's something else you should know, Delia continued. Daniel was supposed to meet Tom the night he died. They were planning to ride out to the Jackson property to look at some horses Tom was thinking of buying, but Daniel canceled at the last minute, said he wasn't feeling well. Did Tom go alone instead? Blaine asked. No, she said slowly. At least that wasn't the plan. Tom told me he was going to stay in town, have a few drinks at the saloon. She frowned. But he wasn't at the saloon that night. I remember because Father commented on it, said it was the first Friday in months Tom hadn't been in to play cards. So where was he? Blaine wondered aloud. And how did he end up at my ranch in the middle of the night? That's the question, isn't it? Delia said. They lapsed into silence, each lost in thought. Finally, Delia glanced at the small watch pinned to her dress and sighed. I need to get back to the saloon, she said. We're expecting a delivery this afternoon. Blaine nodded. Thank you for talking with me and for being willing to consider that I might be telling the truth. She rose, gathering her small purse. I don't know what the truth is anymore, Blaine. But I do know that Tom was my friend, and if someone killed him and let another friend take the blame. Her expression hardened. I want that person to answer for it. They will, Blaine promised, one way or another. As she turned to leave, he added softly, you still wear the locket. Her hand went to the silver pendant automatically. Force of habit, she said, but the flush that crept up her neck told a different story. "It looks good on you," Blaine said. "Always did." She didn't reply, but her fingers lingered on the locket for a moment before she walked away, leaving Blaine to his meal and his thoughts. The rest of the day passed in a blur of conversations and inquiries. Blaine visited the general store, the bank, where he received decidedly cold treatment, and even the barber shop, gathering snippets of information and impressions. Everywhere he went, he was met with a mixture of hostility, curiosity, and from a few older residents who had known him before, cautious neutrality. By evening, he had a clearer picture of how Clearwater Springs had changed in his absence. The town had grown more prosperous, thanks largely to the anticipation of the railroad's arrival. The Wilkinsons and Burns had indeed grown wealthy from land speculation and investments. Judge Turner, though aging, still held considerable sway over town affairs. And Daniel Burns, it seemed, had stepped seamlessly into the role once occupied by Tom Wilkinson, the town's golden boy, respected businessman, and soon-to-be husband of the most desirable woman in the county. It was almost dark when Blaine returned to the livery stable. Becker was working late, shoeing a horse by lamplight. He nodded at Blaine's return but didn't interrupt his work. Midnight nickered a greeting as Blaine entered the stall, and he spent a few minutes brushing the horse down, finding comfort in the familiar routine. His mind was buzzing with all he'd learned, all he still needed to discover. "You got a visitor earlier," Becker said as Blaine emerged from the stall. "Sheriff Preston left a message." Blaine frowned. "What kind of message?" "Said to tell you Judge Turner is holding a town meeting tomorrow morning about the railroad. Thought you might be interested." "Did he now?" Blaine mused. "That is interesting." "Also said to tell you to keep your head down tonight," Becker added. "Some of the younger men were talking big at the saloon this afternoon about running you out of town." "Thanks for the warning," Blaine said, "but I can handle myself," Becker grunted. "No doubt, but handling yourself and handling 6 drunk cowboys are different matters." "I'll be careful," Blaine promised. "Think I'll turn in early anyway." After a simple supper of bread, cheese, and dried beef from his saddlebags, Blaine climbed up to his loft room. He lit the small lamp on the table, removed his gun belt, and sat down to clean his Colt, another familiar routine that helped him think. As he worked, he pieced together what he knew. The railroad deal had been in jeopardy a week before Tom's death. Tom had planned to meet Burns that night, but the meeting was canceled. Instead of staying in town as he'd told Delia, Tom had ridden out to Blaine's ranch late at night. Someone else had been there, had shot Tom, and left Blaine to take the blame. But who? And why had Tom come to the ranch in the first place? Blaine was so deep in thought that he almost missed the soft sound from outside, a footstep on the ladder leading to his room. In one fluid motion, he reassembled his gun, loaded it, and moved to the side of the door, extinguishing the lamp as he went. The door creaked open slowly. A figure slipped inside, silhouetted against the faint starlight from the window. "Blaine," a familiar voice whispered. "Are you here?" He lowered his gun immediately. "Delia," she jumped at his voice, then peered into the darkness. "Where are you?" "Here," he said, stepping forward. "What are you doing here? It's not safe." "I had to warn you," she said urgently. "Daniel and some others, they're planning to come for you tonight. To run you out of town, or worse." "Becker mentioned something about that," Blaine said, "but I didn't think Burns would actually go through with it." "He's been drinking," Delia said. "Him and Judge Turner's nephew and some of the ranch hands, they're working themselves up to it." "And you came to warn me," Blaine observed. "Your fiancé won't be happy about that." Even in the darkness, he could see her stiffen. "This isn't about Daniel, it's about doing what's right. I don't want to see you hurt, whatever happened 5 years ago." "Thank you," he said sincerely. "But you shouldn't be here. If they find out." "They won't," she interrupted. "They think I'm at home with a headache. No one saw me come." She hesitated. "But there's something else, something I remembered after we spoke earlier." "What is it?" "The night Tom died, after I left the saloon, I saw Daniel. He was coming out of his father's bank and he looked strange, agitated. He was carrying a rifle." Blaine's heart raced. "What time was this?" "Late, after midnight. I was on my way home from closing the saloon." "Did you ask him about it later?" "No," she admitted. After everything that happened with you and Tom, I forgot about it until today, but now I can't stop thinking about it. Why would Daniel be at the bank at that hour with a rifle? It was a good question, one that added to Blaine's suspicions about Burns' involvement in Tom's death. Delia, he said carefully, I think Burns knows more about what happened that night than he's admitted. I think he might have been there. At your ranch, she asked, her voice rising slightly. You think Daniel shot Tom? I think it's possible, Blaine said. And I think the argument you overheard between him and his father might have been about exactly that blood on their hands. She was quiet for a long moment. If that's true, if Daniel killed Tom and let you take the blame. Her voice hardened. I need to know, I need to be sure. We'll find out, Blaine promised. But first, we need to deal with tonight. If Burns and his friends are coming for me, I need to be ready. You should leave, Delia urged. Just for tonight, ride out, come back when they've cooled down. Blaine shook his head, though she probably couldn't see it in the darkness. Running won't solve anything. It didn't 5 years ago, and it won't now. Then what will you do? She asked, concern evident in her voice. Face them, he said simply, but on my terms, not theirs. He thought for a moment. When are they planning to come? Soon. They were finishing their drinks when I slipped out. Then we don't have much time. Blaine moved to the window, peering out at the darkness. You need to go, Delia. Get home before they realize you're gone. I can't just leave you to face them alone, she protested. You can and you will, he said firmly. I won't have you caught in the middle of this. Go home, lock your doors, and stay inside. I'll come find you tomorrow when it's safe. She hesitated, then stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. Be careful, Blaine, please. The touch of her hand, the concern in her voice, it was almost his undoing. For a moment, he was tempted to pull her into his arms, to hold her one more time in case things went badly tonight. But that wouldn't be fair to her, not when she was engaged to another man, not when her feelings were so clearly conflicted. I will, he promised instead. Now go. She lingered a moment longer, then slipped out the door and down the ladder, her footsteps fading into the night. Blaine took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. He needed a plan, one that wouldn't result in bloodshed if he could help it, but would also ensure his safety. Burns and his friends might be drunk and angry, but they weren't killers, at least, most of them weren't. Burns himself was another matter. If Blaine's suspicions were correct, Daniel Burns had already killed once and gotten away with it. There was no telling what he might do if cornered or exposed. Moving quickly, Blaine strapped on his gun belt and gathered his few possessions. He had no intention of running, but neither did he plan to be trapped in the loft when Burns and his men arrived. Better to meet them on open ground, where he could see them coming and control the confrontation. He climbed down the ladder quietly, grateful that Becker seemed to have finished his work and retired for the night. Midnight stirred in his stall as Blaine approached, sensing his master's tension. Easy, boy, Blaine murmured, quickly saddling the horse. We're not going far. Leading Midnight by the reins, Blaine slipped out the back of the livery stable and into the darkness beyond. The night was clear, stars blazing overhead, a quarter moon providing just enough light to see by. He circled around behind the row of buildings, keeping to the shadows, until he reached a position that gave him a clear view of the approach to the livery. He didn't have to wait long. Within 20 minutes, he heard the sound of horses approaching 5 or 6 from the sound of it. They stopped in front of the livery, and men's voices carried through the still night air. You sure he's in there? One asked. That's what Floyd at the general store said, another replied. Burns, Blaine recognized. Said Mitchell came back here hours ago and hasn't left since. Well, let's get this over with, a third voice said. I got an early start tomorrow. Remember, we're just escorting him to the town limits, Burns said, though his tone suggested he'd be happy with a more violent outcome, making it clear he's not welcome here, and if he resists. Someone asked. Then we make our point more forcefully, Burns replied coldly. Blaine had heard enough. Leading Midnight a short distance away, he mounted up and circled back toward the front of the livery, approaching the group of men from the street rather than from behind. Looking for me, gentlemen, he called, his voice carrying in the quiet night. The men whirled, reaching for their guns. Burns, at the front of the group, peered through the darkness. Mitchell? The same, Blaine confirmed, urging Midnight forward at a walk. The horse's hooves made a steady rhythm on the packed dirt. "I heard you were planning a welcoming committee. Thought I'd save you the trouble of breaking down Mr. Becker's door." As he drew closer, he could make out the faces of the men Burns, Judge Turner's nephew Charles, and 4 ranch hands Blaine didn't recognize. They were all armed, and from their unsteady postures, at least somewhat drunk. "We're here to escort you out of town," Burns said, his hand hovering near his gun. "Permanently?" "I'm not leaving," Blaine replied calmly. "Not until I've finished what I came to do." "You've got no choice," Burns insisted. "Either ride out now peacefully or we'll make you." Blaine laughed softly. 6 against 1. "Those odds might seem favorable to you, Burns, but I wouldn't be too confident. I've faced worse in the past 5 years. "Big talk from a man who ran rather than face justice," Charles Turner sneered. "I faced plenty of justice on my own," Blaine replied. "Just not the hanging kind that your uncle had planned for me. You deserve to hang for what you did to Tom," Burns said. "That's the thing, Burns," Blaine said, his voice hardening. "I didn't do anything to Tom, but I'm starting to think you did." A tense silence followed his accusation. The other men looked between Blaine and Burns in confusion. "What's he talking about, Daniel?" one of the ranch hands asked. "He's talking nonsense," Burns snapped, "trying to confuse the issue." "Am I?" Blaine challenged. "Or am I getting too close to the truth?" "Where were you the night Tom died, Burns? You were supposed to meet him, but you canceled, said you weren't feeling well. Yet Delia saw you coming out of the bank after midnight with a rifle." Burns' face paled visibly even in the moonlight. "She's lying. She never mentioned seeing me that night." "She didn't remember until recently," Blaine said. "Too much happened that night too quickly, but she remembers now." "This is ridiculous," Burns blustered, looking to his companions for support. "He's trying to turn us against each other. Mitchell killed Tom, everyone knows that. Do they?" Blaine asked quietly. "Or do they just know what you and Judge Turner and Wilkinson told them to believe, that I killed Tom because we were rivals for Delia's affection?" "You were rivals," Charles pointed out. "We were," Blaine acknowledged, "but we weren't enemies. Not the kind that kill each other. Ask anyone who knew us both before that night." The men shifted uncomfortably, looking less certain than they had moments before. "Enough of this," Burns said suddenly, drawing his gun. "Mitchell, you're leaving town tonight one way or another." Blaine's hand moved to his own weapon, but he didn't draw. "Think carefully about what you're doing, Burns. Sheriff Preston knows I'm in town legally. He knows about my pardon. If anything happens to me, there will be questions, uncomfortable ones, about why the town's leading citizens were so desperate to get rid of me." "He's right, Daniel," one of the ranch hands said uneasily. "This ain't what we agreed to. You said we were just going to escort him out, not shoot him." "Put the gun away, Burns," Blaine said quietly. "Go home, sleep it off. We can talk about Tom's death in the light of day with clear heads." For a moment it seemed as if Burns might actually pull the trigger. His hand shook slightly, his eyes wild with a mixture of fear and anger. Then slowly he lowered the gun. "This isn't over, Mitchell," he warned. "Not by a long shot." "No," Blaine agreed. "It isn't, but it will be soon. The truth has a way of coming out, no matter how hard people try to bury it." Burns holstered his weapon and turned his horse. "Let's go," he told the others. "He's not worth the trouble tonight." The men followed, casting uncertain glances back at Blaine as they rode away. Only Charles Turner lingered, studying Blaine with narrowed eyes. "My uncle was right about you," he said finally. "You're dangerous." "Only to those with something to hide," Blaine replied. Charles snorted, then turned his horse to follow the others. Blaine watched until they disappeared into the darkness, then let out a long breath. That had been too close. Burns was growing desperate, which made him unpredictable. And Delia was engaged to marry him in less than a month. The thought sent a chill through Blaine. If Burns really had killed Tom and framed Blaine for it, what might he do to protect that secret? How far would he go to ensure his future with Delia? Blaine turned midnight back toward the livery stable. He needed to rest, to prepare for tomorrow's town meeting. But even as he unsaddled his horse and climbed back up to his loft room, his mind was racing, piecing together a plan to expose the truth once and for all. Because one thing was becoming increasingly clear. time was running out for justice, for the truth, and for any chance of a future with Delia.